All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep, really deep, into the story of one of the most iconic figures in tech, Steve Jobs.
Yeah, he's a legend.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're using Walter Isaacson's biography. But the goal here isn't just to rehash the events, the timeline of his life. It's to really understand, the core experiences that shaped him. What made his approach to innovation so unique? What was it about his relationship with technology that was so different? And, we can't avoid it, his leadership style, which, let's be honest, could be pretty intense. We're looking for those hidden levers, the things that made him who he was.
And I think what's so fascinating about Isaacson's book is the level of access Jobs gave him. He insisted on absolutely no control over the content, no pre-publication review, nothing.
Wow, that's pretty rare.
It is. And it allowed Isaacson to paint this really candid, unvarnished portrait. I mean, he talked to everyone, from Jobs' closest friends to, people who really clashed with him. It's about as honest a look as you're going to get.
Totally. So we're taking you on a journey back to the beginning, those early chapters that set the stage for everything that followed. We're not just listing dates and facts. We're looking for those key insights, those aha moments that reveal where his innovative spirit came from.
Right. The roots of it all.
Exactly. So let's start with his adoption. His parents, Paul and Claire Jobs, they both really wanted a family. Claire had a tough start. Her parents were Armenian immigrants. She lost her first husband in World War II.
It was a really tragic time for her.
For sure. And Paul, also a World War II veteran, he also wanted stability, that sense of a settled life. They got married in Wisconsin, then moved to Indiana.
And they really wanted children, but Clara couldn't conceive after an ectopic pregnancy.
So after 9 years of marriage, they decided to adopt. Meanwhile, Steve's biological mother, Joanne Schiebel, she came from a really strict traditional family in rural Wisconsin. Her father, Arthur Schiebel, he sounds like a very imposing figure, especially when it came to his daughter's relationships.
He definitely was. He didn't approve of Joanne's first love at all. And then, when she fell in love with Abdulfatah John Jandali, a Muslim teaching assistant at the University of Wisconsin where she was a graduate student, her father he basically threatened to disown her.
Wow. That's intense.
It was. And that context is crucial because it directly led to the circumstances surrounding Steve's birth and, of course, his adoption.
So Joanne gave birth to Steve, and soon after, he was adopted by Paul and Claire Jobs. They had moved to Mountain View, California. And that location, it's not just a random detail, is it? It's incredibly significant.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. This was the early 70s. Mountain View was becoming this hotbed of engineering and technology. It was fueled in part by military investment. The Jobs family lived in an Eichler home, which is interesting because those homes were known for their modern, affordable design.
Right. There's a whole aesthetic to them.
Exactly. And Jobs himself remembered those days. He talked about the apricot and plum orchards that used to be everywhere, gradually being replaced by tech companies. And of course, you can't forget about NASA Ames Research Center. He even talked about visiting a computer terminal there with his dad and just falling in love with it.
It's amazing to think how that environment, surrounded by technology, must have subtly shaped him.
It's hard to imagine it didn't, right?
Totally. But on a more personal level, the book goes into Jobs finding out he was adopted. It wasn't just a fact. It really messed with his sense of self. This is a pivotal moment for him, and it kind of fostered this lifelong sense of being an outsider. He didn't quite belong.
And I think that sense of being different, of not fitting in, really fueled his drive to challenge the status quo, to disrupt and redefine things.
So that feeling became a source of energy for him.
Exactly. But here's another crucial piece of the puzzle. His parents, Paul and Clara, they realized very early on that Steve was exceptionally bright. I mean, maybe even brighter than they were.
And how did they react to that? Because that could go a lot of different ways.
It could. But they were incredible. They were so supportive. They totally embraced his intellectual curiosity, always feeding him new information, making sure he had the best educational opportunities. They were willing to adjust to his needs, recognizing that he wasn't like other kids. I mean, they even moved to a different neighborhood so he could go to a better school.
It's like they intuitively knew he was extraordinary.
They did. And that early support system, I think, was absolutely crucial to his later success.
It makes you wonder how things would have turned out if they hadn't been so attuned to him.
It really does. I mean, his intellectual development was rapid. By the end of fourth grade, his teacher, Mrs. Hill, recognized his potential. She had him tested, and the results were, Shocking. He was scoring at a high school sophomore level.
That's insane.
I know, right? The school actually suggested he skip 2 grades.
2 grades, wow.
Yeah, it was a huge leap. But his parents decided to skip him just 1, which, probably made more sense socially for a kid that age. But then came middle school, and that was a whole different story.
Crittenden Middle School, right?
Yeah. It was a rough environment. A lot of ethnic gangs, fights were a daily occurrence. It was a huge contrast to his earlier school, Montaloma Elementary, which was much more nurturing.
I can only imagine how tough that must have been for him. Socially awkward, incredibly smart, and suddenly in this really volatile environment.
It definitely wasn't easy. But outside of school, his dad, Paul Jobs, played a huge role in his early exposure to electronics.
Yeah, those weekends spent tinkering with cars.
Exactly. Those trips to junkyards, taking things apart, scavenging for parts.
Yeah.
It was all about, the rudiments of electronics, as Jobs put it. He learned how to bargain, how to see value in things other people had discarded.
And his dad actually used those skills to fund Steve's college education, didn't he? Like buying, fixing, and selling cars.
He did. It was pretty resourceful.
Totally. And then there was the Hewlett-Packard Explorers Club, which for someone like Jobs must have been like heaven.
Oh, yeah. It was like a dream come true. Hanging out at HP, listening to engineers talk about cutting-edge technology. It was all so exciting.
I love the story about him getting a tour of HP's holography lab.
It's amazing, right? Like something out of a science fiction movie. But the real revelation for him was seeing those early computers HP was developing.
Like the HP 9100A, right?
Exactly. He jokingly called it a glorified calculator, but he was clearly fascinated by it. He saw its potential, even though it was pretty primitive by today's standards. It was one of the very first desktop computers, and he just, fell in love.
It's fascinating how that early fascination with technology seems to run parallel with his interest in spirituality. It seems like a bit of a contradiction.
It does, doesn't it? But you have to remember the context. This was the early 70s. The Vietnam War was ending, and there was this shift on college campuses, this search for personal meaning. Jobs was really drawn to all sorts of books about spirituality and enlightenment, especially Be Here Now by Baba Ram Dass.
He even said it transformed him and many of his friends.
And he wasn't alone in this. He connected with other people who were also exploring these ideas, like Daniel Kopke. And then there was Robert Friedland, who went to India to meet Neem Karoli Baba, also known as Maharaji. Friedland came back totally changed. He had a new spiritual name and this unshakable belief in the possibility of enlightenment, and that really influenced Jobs. It's almost like these two sides of him, the tech innovator and the spiritual seeker, were developing at the same time.
It's a fascinating duality.
Yeah.
So how did these two seemingly separate interests start to come together as he entered the workforce?
Well, his tech fascination never really went away. Bill Hewlett himself actually helped Jobs get his first summer job at, Hewlett-Packard. And then came Atari.
Atari. That was a wild time.
It was. And it really gives you a glimpse into his personality even back then. He worked with Al Alcorn and Don Lang, and Lang's first impression of Jobs was pretty, memorable. He basically called him a hippie with BO.
Oh, no.
I know, right? Jobs was a vegetarian and kind of had this idea that his diet prevented body odor, so he didn't wear deodorant or shower very often.
Not a great combination.
Not at all. Nolan Bushnell, who ran Atari, he actually liked Jobs' drive and vision, but to deal with, shall we say, the hygiene issue, he put Jobs on the night shift. So he was basically isolated from everyone else.
Smart move.
Definitely. But even then, Jobs was known for being pretty harsh in his judgments. He called people dumb shits all the time.
He didn't hold back.
Not at all. He even said later that he stood by those judgments. He thought he was just that much smarter than everyone else.
Wow. That's some serious confidence. But Bushnell also gave him a pretty important project to design the single-player version of Breakout.
Yeah, the arcade game. But there was a bit of a hidden motive there. You see, Bushnell knew Jobs wasn't really an engineer, so he figured Jobs would rope in Steve Wozniak, who was a much better engineer. It was like a 2-for-1 deal for Bushnell.
That's clever. So Breakout was kind of a testing ground for their partnership. And by the mid-70s, the personal computer market was starting to take off. You had companies like Altair and MSI coming out with these early machines. And then Jobs and Wozniak show up at the Personal Computer Festival in Atlantic City with the Apple I and a prototype of Wozniak's next design.
It was a real eye-opener for them. They were like these two young guys with their Apple I, which was basically housed in cigar boxes. And they were surrounded by these established companies, these serious business people, and all this jargon they'd never heard
It
before.
must have been intimidating.
It was. Wozniak even said he felt really nervous listening to all the business talk.
So it's the classic underdog story. And as they started developing the Apple II, Jobs already had very specific ideas about how it should look. He wasn't happy with the design of other computers at all.
No, not at all. He wanted something totally different. He wanted it to be sleek, aesthetically pleasing, something that would stand out from those clunky metal boxes everyone else was making.
Right, it had to be more than just functional.
Exactly. And he found his inspiration in a pretty unexpected place, Macy's. He was looking at appliances and became obsessed with the Cuisinart food processors. He loved their clean, molded plastic cases.
So that's where that came from.
Yep. He even hired Jerry Manick to design the case for the Apple II, and Manick delivered. He created this simple, friendly, foam-molded plastic case that Jobs just loved.
It's amazing how that focus on design was there right from the start.
It really was. And as Apple started to become a real company, Jobs' personality really started to show. There were some early clashes, little hints of the conflicts to come, like the story about the employee badge numbers.
Oh yeah, that's a classic.
So Scott, one of the early guys at Apple, he assigns badge number 1 to Wozniak and number 2 to Jobs.
Seems logical.
You'd think so, right? But Jobs flipped out. He demanded to be number 1, even threw a tantrum about it.
Really?
Yeah, there are stories about him crying over it. In the end, he insisted on having badge number 0.
Typical Jobs, finding a way to be unique.
Totally. But there are also more fundamental disagreements brewing, like the one with Jay Elliott.
Elliott was hired by Jobs, right, after a chance meeting.
Exactly. But they had very different ideas about how to run the company. And this was all happening while the Apple II was a huge success. But Apple was already looking ahead. They were working on the Apple III, the Lisa project, which was super ambitious, but ultimately didn't do well. And then there was Jeff Raskin's Macintosh project.
So many projects at once. And the Macintosh was all about creating a low-cost, user-friendly computer with a graphical interface. It sounds like Raskin's vision was very much aligned with making computers more accessible to everyday people.
It was. And he even tried to get Apple interested in the research happening at Xerox PRC. They were pioneering all these groundbreaking ideas about graphical user interfaces.
And just for our listeners, Xerox PRR was a research center that developed a lot of the graphical interface concepts we use today.
It was a pretty amazing place. But Jobs had his own ideas about design.
Like his reaction to that Japanese engineer's comment about one of the Mac's features. The engineer said, "This is shit."
Yeah, it sounds harsh, but apparently it wasn't meant as a straight-up insult.
Right, it was more of a challenge, like, convince me why this is good.
Exactly. And that's how Jobs took it. He challenged the engineer to explain his reasoning, and in the process, the engineer came up with an even better solution.
Wow. So Jobs' criticism, even when it was blunt, could actually lead to improvements.
Absolutely. But it also shows his absolute intolerance for anything less than perfection. Bill Atkinson said that if you didn't share that same obsessive attention to detail, you were just a bozo in Jobs' eyes.
And that clashed big time with Adam Osborne's philosophy, adequacy is sufficient.
Yeah.
Jobs thought that was just awful, like morally wrong.
He did. He even said Osborne was just making shit, not creating art.
So this commitment to perfection, it wasn't just about the inside of the machine. It was about the outside, too, like the design of the Macintosh case.
Yeah, he worked with Hartmut Esslinger from Frog Design on that. And Esslinger said later that even though Jobs didn't draw the lines himself, his ideas, his inspiration were what made the design what it was. That whole concept of a friendly computer design, that was all Jobs.
And it wasn't just the hardware. He was equally obsessed with the software, with how things looked on screen. Remember the story about Bill Atkinson's circle drawing algorithm?
Oh, yeah. Atkinson was this brilliant programmer, super proud of this algorithm he'd created to draw perfect circles and ovals on the screen. And Jobs' response was, "Circles and ovals are good, Bill, but how about rectangles with rounded corners?"
He had such a specific vision, down to the tiniest details.
He did. And it wasn't just about what the user saw. He even cared about the beauty of the internal components, even though most people would never see them.
It's like that analogy he used about the carpenter who uses beautiful wood even for the back of a cabinet, the part nobody sees.
Exactly. For Jobs, it was about integrity, about doing things the right way, even if nobody knew. He wanted to be able to sleep well at night, knowing that everything was perfect, inside and out.
And that desire for control, It went beyond the hardware and software. He wanted to control the entire ecosystem. He wanted developers to create software specifically for the Mac OS. And he really didn't like the idea of licensing the Mac OS to other companies, did he?
No, he hated it. Mike Murray, who was in charge of Mac marketing, suggested licensing it to Tandy in 1982. He thought it could make the Mac OS the industry standard. But Jobs was completely against it. He wanted to keep control, even if it meant limiting the Mac's market share.
He was willing to sacrifice potential growth for the sake of control.
It seems that way. But sometimes his insistence on control had unexpected benefits. Like the story about the Alps floppy disk drive for the Mac.
Oh yeah, the one that was delayed.
Yeah. So a group of engineers, led by Burl Smith, they secretly decided to clone the Sony floppy disk drive, which was much better.
They went rogue.
They did. And at first, Jobs was totally confused when he saw Sony's disk designer in Cupertino. But when he realized what they'd done, he actually thanked them for disobeying him.
He swallowed his pride.
He did, because he knew they'd done the right thing for the product.
And speaking of key people in the Apple story, we have to talk about John Sculley. Bringing him in from Pepsi was a big deal.
Huge deal. And Jobs really worked his magic to convince him to come to Apple, you know, that famous reality distortion field. They talked all night, Jobs laid out his vision, and Sculley was just like blown away. He said it was one of the most exhilarating evenings of his professional life.
But their relationship eventually fell apart, didn't it?
It did. They disagreed on a lot of things, but one of the big ones was the price of the Macintosh. Sculley wanted it to be $2,495, which was a lot higher than the engineers and probably Jobs wanted.
And Jobs fought him on it, right?
He did, but he lost. And he later believed that that decision really hurt the Mac's sales and gave Microsoft a big advantage.
So there's this tension between Jobs' vision and the realities of the market.
Exactly. And then there's the whole Bill Gates saga. I mean, their relationship was so complicated.
Fascinating and frustrating all at the same time.
Absolutely. They both thought they were smarter than the other. Jobs saw Gates as lacking taste, no design sense. Gates thought Jobs was, fundamentally odd.
And then there was the whole issue of the graphical user interface, with Jobs accusing Microsoft of stealing Apple's ideas.
Yeah, the theft of the GUI. Gates always argued that Microsoft had just as much right to use ideas from Xerox PyArcs as Apple did.
But Jobs felt betrayed.
He did. He thought Apple had done all the hard work creating this elegant, user-friendly interface, and then Microsoft just came along and copied it.
And in the end, Windows became the dominant operating system.
It did. And Jobs, even years later, would rant about Microsoft having no taste.
It really bothered him.
It did. He felt like the best product hadn't won. And as the Mac struggled, Apple started making some desperate moves, like turning the unsold Lisa computers into the Macintosh XL.
Which was a disaster.
Right. It was. Andy Hertzfeld even called it a horrible hoax and quit Apple because of it.
It's like they were betraying the original spirit of the Mac.
Exactly. And then Jobs turned 30. It was a turning point for him, a time for reflection. He even gave this really interesting interview to Playboy magazine, talking about aging and the importance of staying childlike. It was a thoughtful interview. He seemed to be grappling with his legacy, wondering how much time he had left to make a real impact.
And it was around this time that he started thinking about what would become next T. He was getting excited about new technologies like flat-screen displays and touch screens.
He even wanted to create this skunkworks lab within Apple, called Apple Labs, to explore these ideas.
But things at Apple were getting worse. His relationship with Sculley was falling apart, and the board was losing faith in him.
Yeah, it all culminated in that board meeting where they basically took away his power.
His reaction was intense, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Like swinging between anger and this desperate need to salvage his friendship with Sculley.
It was. He was really hurt. And being pushed aside, moved to this empty building, he felt like he was in exile. He even compared it to being sent to Siberia.
He couldn't stand being sidelined. And then Sculley made that public statement saying that Jobs was basically irrelevant to Apple's future.
Ouch. That must have stung.
Big time. And maybe that's why Jobs took that trip to Europe. He needed to get away to find some inspiration.
And he found it in the architecture of Florence, of all places. He was really captivated by the paving stones there, the bluish-gray ones from the Il Cassone quarry.
Those stones actually ended up influencing the design of the Apple stores, didn't they?
They did. It's amazing how those small details can have such a big impact later on.
And then came the final board meeting. Jobs announced he was leaving Apple to start a new company. He tried to frame it as non-competitive, focusing on higher education.
And he even offered to resign as chairman.
He was trying to leave on somewhat good terms, but there was definitely tension in the air.
Oh, yeah. And so NEC XT was born.
And true to form, he had very specific design ideas for the NeXT computer.
Oh, yeah. He insisted it had to be a perfect cube.
A cube. Why a cube?
He just loved the look of it. But it actually made things more difficult for the engineers. The internal components had to be arranged in a less efficient way because of the cube shape.
So form over function.
In this case, maybe a little bit. But he also had this idea of bundling content with the computer, like a digital dictionary and the complete works of Shakespeare.
That's pretty innovative for the time.
Oh, was! He even went to Oxford to negotiate the Shakespeare deal himself. And after they signed the contract, he celebrated with a game of Skittles at a pub that Lord Byron used to frequent.
Only Steve Jobs could pull that off.
Only him. But despite the initial excitement, NeXT ran into trouble pretty quickly. The product deadlines were slipping, and they were running out of money.
Classic startup problems.
They are. And Jobs tried to raise more money, but the valuation he was asking for was just too high. Nobody wanted to invest.
So what did he do?
He pulled off a pretty surprising move. He partnered with IBM. They agreed to license NeXT SEP, NeXT's operating system.
Wow. IBM and NeXT. That's an unlikely pairing.
It was. And Jobs wanted to keep it a secret, but IBM insisted on announcing it right away. Bill Gates was furious when he found out. He saw it as a threat to Microsoft.
He must have been worried that IBM would switch to NeXT STEP and ditch Windows.
It was a real possibility, and ironically, other companies like Compaq and Dell were also interested in NeXT's technology.
So things were looking up for NeXT, at least for a little while.
For a while, yeah. And throughout all this, Jobs never lost sight of Pixar. He really believed in their animation team, protected them from all the financial ups and downs at NeXT.
He saw them as something special.
He did. He kept investing in their short films, even when NeXT was struggling. He was really drawn to John Lasseter's passion and storytelling ability.
And while all this was going on, he was also reconnecting with his family.
Yeah, his sister Mona Simpson.
And his daughter Lisa.
Right. But he had no interest in meeting his biological father. He was still angry about how his father had treated Mona.
Understandable.
Yeah. But he did have a good relationship with his biological mother, Joanne Simpson. They would visit each other, especially at Christmas, and it was always very emotional. Jobs would reassure her that he'd had a good childhood, that everything had turned out okay.
That's sweet.
It is. But his relationship with Lisa, it was complicated. He denied being her father for years, and that caused a lot of pain. But as Lisa got older, they started to connect, though it was always a bit strained.
And then there's Laureen Powell, the love of his life.
They met at Stanford, and Jobs was instantly smitten. He asked her out, but she was honest with him, told him she was already seeing someone else. But eventually, she chose Jobs, and he always said she was the only person who truly understood him.
He had other relationships, of course. Jennifer Egan, Chrisanne Brennan, Tina Redsea. But Laureen was different.
She was. And even after he married Laureen, he still had feelings for some of those past loves, especially Tina Redsea. They reconnected later during his illness, and he said she was one of the purest people he'd ever known.
So even with Laureen, there was still some complexity in his love life.
There was. And their marriage proposal was pretty typical Jobs. It involved a disastrous attempt at a bachelor party organized by Avi Tevanian.
Oh no, what happened?
It was a comedy of errors. But Jobs actually found it funny. And he even helped set Tevanian up with his sister Mona, who Tevanian later married.
That's a happy ending, at least.
It is. And their wedding was at the Ahwahnee Lodge in Yosemite. It was a small affair, but Jobs still insisted on controlling every detail. He even chartered a bus to take everyone to the location.
He couldn't let go of control, even on his wedding day?
He couldn't. And they settled into a pretty normal family life in Palo Alto. Their house was this storybook-style place that they renovated, and Laureen created a beautiful garden.
It sounds idyllic.
It does.
Yeah.
And then Toy Story came out, and Pixar became a huge success. It's interesting that there are two premieres. Disney had a big one in LA, but Jobs skipped it. Instead, he had his own premiere in San Francisco for the Silicon Valley crowd.
He wanted to celebrate on his own terms.
He did. And back at NeXT, they were making progress. Jean-Louis Gasset, who used to work at Apple, actually defended NeXT publicly. He praised their creativity, which Jobs really appreciated. And then they announced that Next Step was being ported to the IBM Intel platform. It was a big deal, and Jobs' father was really proud to see him up on stage with Andy Grove from Intel.
It was a moment of validation for Jobs and for NXT.
Definitely. And while all this was going on, Apple was still struggling. D'Amelio was CEO, but he wasn't doing a great job. And Aby Tevanian and John Rubinstein, who had gone back to Apple from NXT, they kept Jobs in the loop about what was happening.
So Jobs was still connected to Apple, even though he wasn't officially there.
He was, and it became clear that he was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes.
The power behind the throne.
Exactly. And eventually, the board brought him back as interim CEO, and he wasted no time shaking things up. He basically forced almost the entire board to resign.
He cleaned house.
He did. And one of the first things he did was call Bill Gates. He wanted to end their rivalry, to work together to save Apple.
That's a huge shift.
It was. He proposed a settlement for all the patent lawsuits, and in return, Microsoft would invest in Apple.
And Gates agreed.
He did. He always had a soft spot for Apple, and he saw the value in keeping them alive.
So they announced this partnership at Macworld, and it was a little awkward. Gates appeared on this giant screen, which made Jobs look kind of small.
It was. But Jobs gave a great speech telling the audience to forget about the rivalry, to move forward together.
He was trying to change the narrative.
He was. And once he was back in control, he really focused on marketing and design. He had these long meetings every week with his marketing team, and he personally approved every ad. And he changed the whole design process at Apple.
It became more designer-centric.
Exactly. He and Jony Ive worked so closely together. Design came first, and then the engineers figured out how to make it happen.
And then iMac was the first big product of this new approach.
It was. Jobs wanted it to be an all-in-one computer, something beautiful and easy to use.
And there's that famous story about the CD tray.
Oh, yeah, during the launch rehearsal, Jobs saw that the tray was visible, and he just flipped out. He wanted a slot-loading drive, even though it was going to be really hard to change at that point.
Nothing could stand in the way of his design vision.
Nothing. He also focused on making Apple's operations more efficient. He cut down on inventory, sped up production times. He was all about making things run smoothly.
And then there's the story about the company uniforms. He got the idea from Sony's chairman, but it ended up being just him who wore a uniform, that black turtleneck.
Yeah, his personal trademark. But despite his controlling nature, he did encourage collaboration. He had lots of meetings, wanted people to debate ideas.
He wanted to hear different perspectives.
He did. And then came the iPod. This was a game changer. Tony Fadell was hired to create Apple's own MP3 player.
And it was more than just an MP3 player. It was the whole ecosystem. The iPod, iTunes, the iTunes Store.
Exactly. And Jobs convinced the music industry to go along with it. He met with the heads of all the big record labels, and he made them see the potential.
The iTunes Store became this massive platform, selling music, videos, apps, everything.
It changed the way we consume media. And Jobs himself had such diverse musical tastes. He loved classical, folk, rock and roll, everything. He even got to release a Bob Dylan boxed set, which he was really proud of.
He was a huge Dylan fan.
He was. And his focus on design extended beyond products. He was obsessed with the design of Pixar's headquarters. He wanted a building that would foster creativity, so he insisted on this central atrium to encourage people to bump into each other and share ideas.
It's like he was designing the interactions himself.
He was. And then Apple switched to Intel processors. It was a huge technical challenge, and even Bill Gates was impressed with how smoothly they pulled it off.
And through it all, Jobs maintained this image of working for $1 a year.
Yeah, while also getting huge stock options.
It was a bit of a contradiction.
It was. And then came the cancer diagnosis. He had pancreatic cancer, but he refused conventional treatment for months. He tried all these alternative therapies, which really worried everyone who cared about him.
It was like he was in denial.
He probably was. He had this ability to block out things he didn't want to face.
And then there was the ROKR phone, his first attempt at a cell phone.
Which was a flop. It was a partnership with Motorola, and it just wasn't a good product. It didn't have that Apple magic.
But then came the iPhone.
And that changed everything. Jobs gave Time magazine an exclusive preview, and he called it the best thing we've ever done.
And he wasn't wrong.
No, he wasn't. It wasn't necessarily revolutionary in terms of technology, but it was so intuitive, so beautifully designed, it just worked.
And on launch day, he went to the Apple Store in Palo Alto to see the crowds. It must have been an amazing feeling.
It was. And then came the iPad. It started as an idea for a low-cost netbook, but Jony Ive suggested using a touchscreen instead of a keyboard.
And that's how the iPad was born.
Pretty much. They spent a lot of time figuring out the right screen size, building all these prototypes.
And at the launch, Jobs called it the